Movies and literature. These are two of our most favorite things, and those who follow our channel know that pretty well. Especially when it comes to Stephen King novels, you know we're always up for that discussion. We know that Stephen King novels aren't just some ghost stories that you read and forget, because they're more than just ghosts and monsters. And in almost every decade, these stories come back again and again through many different screen adaptations. But do they all blindly follow the ending that King has written? Well, no. Otherwise, Kubrick could have been King's all-time favorite director, but that's not the case. Some creative choices made by the directors have impressed him, and some haven't. In today's video, I'm going to break it down for you why and mention the top 10 of his book-to-screen adaptations. Let's get started.
Wendy, I'm home.
The Shining. We can't really start the list without starting it with The Shining, one of my favorite Kubrick films. The film was based on Stephen King's 1977 titular horror novel, which is, of course, a great one, but I liked the movie better because of its ending. And speaking of endings, the resolution of the novel isn't exactly the one we watched in the film. And this was the reason why King never really approved of Kubrick's take on his beloved horror story. In the novel, Jack Torrance was definitely possessed by the Overlook's evil energy, but at the end, he regained his human conscience for some moments. Before the Overlook's boiler explosion occurred, it was Jack who wanted to save his family, so he helped his son Danny run away from the hotel. Danny and Wendy managed to escape and survive the explosion, while Jack was killed in the end. Now, this ending suggests that Jack's character wasn't outright evil. Rather, he was under the influence of some sort of evil energy, and his inner humanity fought back to save his family, which is quite a redemptive ending for Jack's arc. But Kubrick didn't want that to happen in his movie. He wanted to show that violence circles back, and people don't really change. That was more like a nihilistic approach that he wanted to use at the end of the story, and honestly, that worked better because, in my opinion, after creating such a menacing villain like Jack, I myself didn't want to see him change. Instead, I appreciated the fact that Jack faced the consequences of his evil and froze to death. But then again, when that old photograph in the hotel showed up at the end of the movie with a young Jack in it, it all made sense, because from the start, Kubrick wanted to strongly emphasize the cyclical nature of violence. After all, King absolutely despised the ending. But well, Kubrick's The Shining became one of the most iconic horror movies of all time.
You're supposed to say 3.
It Chapter 2. You know, a Stephen King-related video without a mention of It would just feel incomplete. The Mist. In The Mist, in the adaptation, I guess we saw the most brilliantly altered ending, which was far better than what was in the novel. So basically, Frank Darabont, whenever he makes an adaptation of a King novel, deliberately changes the ending and clears out the ambiguity for the film audience. Not just The Mist, but in Shawshank or Green Mile, he did the same, and you'll know as I'm going to talk about them in this video. Darabont's creative decision for The Mist was appreciated by King himself. In King's 1980 novel, the ending was totally ambiguous because David Drayton, along with the survivors, went into the mist towards Hartford after hearing a radio signal. Although the tone was ambiguous, King suggested that the characters might find hope in the end. But when Frank Darabont made the 2007 adaptation of the story, he made some great choices. In the film's ending, David and the group of survivors surely went into the mist, but then David mercy killed everyone, including his own son, when there was no way out of the terrifying mist. With some monstrous creatures surrounding them and their fuel running out, David thought he had no other choice but to kill them. However, in the end, the army gathered around the area trying to reclaim it when David was seen in the inescapable agony of losing everything he had. This ending was bone-chilling, as it brings out the most raw and brutal form of reality, almost like a gut punch of reality delivered by Darabont. The ending was widely appreciated, and even the King himself called it a terrific one.
White doctor from town.
Thinner. And for our next movie, let's talk about Thinner, a Stephen King adaptation which isn't exactly my favorite, but yes, let's talk about it anyway. For the same reason as the previous ones, Thinner belongs to this list. In the 1984 novella Thinner, the protagonist, named Billy Halleck, ran over a Romani elder, Tadzu Lemke's daughter, Suzanne. It was an accident, but Tadzu couldn't forgive him and ended up cursing him. Now, to lift the curse, Billy got a humble pie made of his own baked blood into a strawberry pie, which he must feed to someone to kill them, in order to get his curse lifted. So Billy decided to kill his wife Heidi by feeding her this pie. And the plan did work, and the next morning Heidi was found dead after eating it. However, things got dark when Billy found his daughter Linda had also eaten some. Overwhelmed by guilt, Billy ended up eating the pie to kill himself. Once again, in classic King style, the character went on a redemptive journey, but it ended tragically for him due to his fatal flaw. So the 1996 film followed the same path with a similar intention, but they made it a little twisted. In the film's ending, Billy did manage to kill his wife, and his daughter did eat some of the poisonous pie too, but here, Billy made one last decision to establish how much pure evil he was. When he found his daughter had eaten the pie, he felt guilty and decided to kill himself. But then the doorbell rang, and it was Dr. Michael Houston, whom he'd always thought had an affair with his wife. So instead of just eating the pie alone, Billy invited Houston in and urged him to have a piece of it. Here, Billy isn't purely redemptive, as his vengefulness isn't quite withered away at the end, and many of you might find it a better or suitable ending for this character. And I do admit that it is, but the movie somehow fell short in a proper execution of the entire story. Dr. Sleep. When Mike Flanagan made Dr. Sleep, I had high expectations for the film. However, the only fatal flaw that Flanagan made was trying to give a tribute to Kubrick throughout this film and ended up making an imitation. Flanagan tried to maintain a bridge between King's novel and Kubrick's adaptation, so he just destroyed the potential of what could have been a great ending. In the 2013 Dr. Sleep novella, which is also considered a sequel to The Shining, the Overlook was in ruins because of the explosion that happened in The Shining. So Danny's final confrontation with True Knot, the group of psychic vampires, and their head, Rose the Hat, happened in the campground. In the end, Jack's spirit came to aid Danny and Abra one last time to destroy the evil, which stays true to what Stephen King originally intended for the story. Also, Danny survives at the end of the novel, while in the film, he didn't. The Overlook Hotel was also there in the film to align with Kubrick's Shining, so the final confrontation happened inside the hotel. Also, Jack's spirit did come, but he was once again the same evil Jack, dressed as the bartender, like what Jack himself once came across during his time at the hotel. Danny's death in the end also felt very unnecessary to me, because that was done just for the sake of completing the generational arc, which disappointed a lot of fans. The Green Mile. I like my horror the more existential the better, and that's why The Green Mile, albeit not a horror novel, was one of my favorite stories written by Stephen King. This novel was published in 1996, and Frank Darabont adapted it into a film in 1999 starring Tom Hanks and Michael Clark Duncan. The Green Mile, well, not exactly as celebrated as Shawshank, is still considered to have some of the best cinematic storytelling, and although it followed the novel almost faithfully, there were some key points that the film didn't want to include. For example, in the novel, the protagonist, Paul Edgecombe, lived a very long life after Jeff Coffey healed him through his touch. But when Paul outlived all of his loved ones, like his wife Janet, who died in a bus accident, he plunged into a prolonged and deep existential despair. The film chose to omit this section from Paul's life. Instead of Janet's death, in the film, we saw Paul with Elaine in the nursing home, trying to recollect his memories from his time on death row work. He talks about his and his friend Brutus's departure from the service, and Elaine asks him to write down the memories to cherish them. In the film, we didn't get to see Paul's emotional journey due to prolonged living. It chose to give both Paul and Coffey's characters a closure, which worked as a catharsis at the end. Children of the Corn. How many of you all are actually fans of Stephen King's short stories? I don't really know, but trust me, they're pretty awesome. Now, this man has always been famous for his novels, but there are some short fiction stories written by him which also got their own adaptations, like Children of the Corn. This story was published in a short story collection called Night Shift in 1978, and was later adapted into a 1984 film with the same name, but the film's final climax majorly deviates from the source material. The short story follows a very consistent grim tone throughout, a very bleak setting where there was no way out for the characters. It was about a couple, Bert and Vicky, driving through a town in Nebraska which seemed pretty normal at first sight, but as they entered, they realized the town was under the rule of a fanatic called Isaac, who runs his murderer children's cult. Vicky was captured by the members of the cult and sacrificed to the deity, he who walks behind the rose. Bert tried to stop them and wanted to fight, but he too was captured and killed by the children in the cornfield. However, nothing such happens in the film, where the two of them survived this threat and came out of this hellish nightmare alive. The film starts off with a heavily grim tone, but by the end, it takes a very typical approach for a resolution. Shawshank Redemption. Shawshank Redemption is probably the most famous one of all the films I discussed here, and some of us still get surprised at the fact that it was actually a Stephen King novella. I think we've already mentioned it 1,000 times on our channel, but it's worth remembering how great both the film and novella was. The film gained worldwide recognition, more specifically because of its hopeful and heart-melting ending. But do you know that that was actually absent from the source material? Yes, King's 1982 novella, Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, didn't feature such a beautiful reunion of two estranged friends. Of course, there was some hope in the end, but that also remained very ambiguous. After coming out of jail, Red followed Andy's trail and ended up in Buxton, Maine, where he found a letter of hope that he might see Andy again in Zihuatanejo. The book ends on this ambiguous note when Red gets on a bus to head south, hoping that he might see Andy again. Thinking, after all, hope is such a good thing. Frank Darabont, however, while filming this, felt that the ending should have a perfect closure, both for the plot and the characters. In the film's ending scene, we saw Red finally ending up in Zihuatanejo, and he embraces his friend Andy on the sun-soaked beach of Mexico, and the two finally find their hope again in life. This is a moment that brings tears to our eyes, one of the iconic cathartic scenes in cinema history. And thus, this change remained a necessary creative choice for the film. Pet Sematary. Next up, of course, I'll have to put my most favorite Stephen King novel, Pet Sematary, and its adaptation, which didn't exactly turn out as I'd hoped. Pet Sematary was published in 1983 and later adapted into a 1989 and a 2019 film, and neither of them do much justice to the original novel. Although the 1989 one was quite an accurate depiction but lacked the atmosphere, the 2019 film deviates from the plot in major ways. The novel follows the Creed family, and especially their toddler son Gage, who was unfortunately run over by a speeding truck and killed. Louis Creed, his father, buried the dead body in the cursed land of Pet Sematary. But after that, Gage was resurrected as an evil spirit took over his body. Gage, being possessed, began a whole murderous spree by killing their neighbor Judd and even killing his own mother, Rachel. Rachel was buried on the same land. So after her death, her spirit returned too. The novel ends on a very climactic note where Rachel's hand is seen over Louis's shoulder, a very chilling scene that suggests the never-ending evil. However, in the film, there were some changes right from the beginning. Gage wasn't the one who was killed, but his sister Ellie was the one who was killed and resurrected. And after Ellie came back as a haunting spirit, she took people out one by one. Rachel also died here, and Louis Creed faced the same fate, except for Gage, who locked himself inside the car, trying not to give in to the spirits. But the film ends with Louis's undead voice repeatedly urging his son to open the car door. The film followed the same path, but changed the character dynamic to make the horror feel like a generational curse. The Running Man. So first of all, I'm not talking about the 2025 adaptation of The Running Man in this video, because Edgar Wright just made it so cool, even Stephen King absolutely loved it. However, the film I'm going to talk about in this video was a total nightmare, because it was meant to be that way. In the 1982 Stephen King novel The Running Man, which was written under the Richard Bachman pseudonym, the protagonist of the story, Ben Richard, was a desperate and broken man. He was under the immense pressure of a dystopian world dominated by a corrupt media. After spending months on the run, he finally came across the truth that the Games Network was actually behind the deaths of his family, so he wanted his revenge. Not just that, but the network also framed the deaths as collateral damage, which really pushed him to expose the corruption and hypocrisy of the media. He hijacked planes and deliberately crashed the headquarters of the network. But at the end, his death wasn't a closure for the story. Rather, it was suicidal and almost an act of sacrifice to protest against the system. The Running Man novel was filled with raw violence and a nuanced portrayal of a harsh reality. But what interested me most about it is King's satirical technique, which mocks the system. However, the 1987 film version of The Running Man featuring Arnold Schwarzenegger couldn't even reach anything close to what Stephen King's source material intended to. Rather, it was more like a B film or a campy movie where the hero wins and the villain dies at the end. It was a typical fan-pleasing hero worship movie that had no profound ending as the novel had. And that's it, guys. 10 book-to-screen adaptations of Stephen King's novels, and most especially my favorite ones. Hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have your favorite one, do let us know in the comments. Until then, goodbye, and I'll see you in the next one.